85 to 90% of all incidents, whether it's at a small, medium-sized, or the biggest of companies such as MGM, and we've seen a few other big breaches this week, it's still the same, still hacking.
Welcome back to another episode of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. And today, my guest is Mike Andrews from Yastis. He's a cybersecurity consultant. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So let's just jump right in. What got you into the cybersecurity field?
Yeah, so I have a 20-year background in the Department of Defense, starting on active duty. Started out in telecommunications, moved into networking, project management. And as part of that, I was handed a cybersecurity program, which allowed me to wet my beak. And then before you knew it, I moved over to the actual cybersecurity office. And my most recent role there was being in charge of cybersecurity for 28,000 user network, both classified and unclassified. And then I just realized I absolutely love it and wanted to do it.
Well, I've also noticed, I just looking at notes that I have on you, also noticed a lot of people who are in cybersecurity today have come through the government. Is there a reason for a trend like that? Do you know?
Yes, definitely, because they take it really, really seriously. They have very elaborate programs for it, whereas in the private sector, it's usually more about what needs to be done, what's an adequate level. Let's not go above and beyond more than what we need to. So we get that solid foundation working for the government, and it really enables us to go out to the private sector and do pretty well with it, whether it's entrepreneurially or working for another company.
It totally makes sense. So if a company wanted to engage with Yastis, do you have a minimum revenue requirement or anything like that?
No, generally the companies we work with make upward at least around 700K to a million, usually more. But it's in that area. But if it makes sense to hire a cybersecurity consultant, most likely if a company will have at least 400,000 in revenue, I'd say.
Perfect. So what do you think is what are some of the more common ways that people today, it's the security arena around the internet has become a bigger and bigger issue. When I was actively working as a CTO, it was a good 10 years ago. And the biggest threat I had to deal with was scammers who registered domains that kind of looked like our domain and then would send out emails to hijacked checks and stuff like that would come through. So, but today it's changed a lot. So what are some of the most common ways people are breached?
Funny you say that, because it's still pretty common today. 85 to 90% of all incidents, whether it's at a small, medium-sized, or the biggest of companies such as MGM, and we've seen a few other big breaches this week, it's still the same, still hacking. The really cool stuff, like you see in a movie, the zero-day vulnerabilities, that doesn't happen now. A lot of companies and even experts put more emphasis on those than it's worth, and sometimes overlook the basics like phishing, things like two-factor authentication, having segmentation, so that way if someone gets in your system, they don't have access to everything.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you mentioned, it was funny, I was going to ask you about MGM because we're both here in the Vegas area. Common way to gain access these days, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They took a very common sense approach. They just looked on LinkedIn, kind of figured out who would probably have a lot of access to their name, and called the help desk and pretended to be them. And within 10 minutes and some simple questions being answered, they had access to get in the system. Why work any harder than you have to if the easy stuff works?
So if MGM had come to you before, even after that, what would your advice have been? How could they have avoided that?
Absolutely. That's a very common part of what I do. If I were doing anything in relation to their help desk, a big part of that would have been about authentication. I would have looked at their process, vetting whoever is contacting them, asking for system access. And from what I heard and verified by at least a handful of sources related to the company, it was extremely simple information, like name, position, and that's just really not good enough. Getting into a system is very important. Think about, for any individual watching, you getting into your bank account, that's pretty important. So when you call your bank, they ask you some serious questions, probably 4 or 5 questions that most people won't know. They don't make it that easy on you, and it's rightfully so. So that's where I
Right.
would
And
definitely
even on top
start.
of that, they'll send you a code that then you have to give them over the phone for them to verify that it's actually you. Um, yeah, I think that was it was a big shocker to a lot of people because they didn't realize, first of all, it's one of the times that it's gotten a lot of publicity because of what company it was. But also interestingly, that it's been happening with a lot of casinos of late, where apparently they're a little lax on their follow up with like finding out who's who. Um, I've had people blame it on work from home. I've had them blame it on all sorts of things, and I'm like, hey, work from home doesn't matter if they call in with the right questions and they give you the right answers to the questions, and you don't bother to validate what they're saying the correct way. I mean, heck, why not be like, hold on, I have your phone number here, let me call you. I mean, even something as simple as that
Yeah.
seems crazy to me. But
Oh,
what
absolutely. It's easy to point the finger and say, oh, it's because we have to work from home, or our software was the vulnerability, not us. But really, there's safeguards that you can put in place that should be considered. I mean, a standard part of our scoping process is to ask the question: do you have people working on site, remote, or both? And then you take those things into account and you use things like mobile device management so you can see what people are doing on their personal devices and their home computers. Not everything, but just in relation to the company aspects of it.
Sure. Well, what are some things that a business can do to avoid a hack like that?
In relation to the phishing or remote work in general.
Just in relation to the phishing.
In relation to the phishing, it's definitely have strong two-factor authentication, whether it's a hardware key or at least an authenticator app on your smartphone, which is usually free. You really want to stay away from having no two-factor authentication, which is kind of common sense, but also anything that's phone number based, whether it's text based or call based, because people are getting SIM swapped left and right. It's not hard to do because a threat actor can simply trick a phone store employee or pay them $2,000 to $10,000 on the dark web and just get access to your phone number. And then if you're relying on that to protect your sensitive apps, they're in your sensitive apps, even though you had the two-factor authentication on. So definitely strong two-factor authentication. You want good segmentation along with least privilege. So say you're a company that has 10 or 20 employees. Do you give everyone access to everything? No, you keep it minimal. You have 2 or 3 people with admin access. You don't want one in case that person leaves the company or whatever the case may be, but you want to limit that so that way there's less surface area for you to have something go wrong. Because in cybersecurity, the more you have, the more vulnerable you are. If you have 20 pieces of software on your system, you're more vulnerable than someone that has 10 comparable, pieces of software. So limit your surface area. It goes a long way. And then, of course, you want to have an incident response plan that basically says, like, what do we do if something goes wrong? What's the process? Like, what system do we restore first? Who do we have to call? Whether it's a service provider or state attorney general's office, investors, business partners, things like that. And then you want to have a good backup. And not only your backup should be truly separated, so that way if your primary system goes down, the backup's still there. And you want to make sure that's working and not just going in and looking at the settings. You want to actually do the restoral process to make sure you can pull it down. Because I've seen numerous times where it looks like it's good to go, and then when you go to actually get that backup and bring it into your primary area, it fails, and then you have nothing.
Yeah, people forget that part of validation is actually doing a restore. I can remember
Absolutely.
teaching a new network guy, how to safely, like, back up, move it off, move it off of our network so it's not sitting,
Yeah.
on the exact, like, he would leave them on the server. He'd back up the email server and leave it on the server. I'm like, well, how does that help if the hard drive goes bad,
Yeah. Yeah.
But he'd say, oh, it's validated, the file got validated through the validation step. Great. Can you restore it? I don't know.
Yeah,
How good does that do you?
exactly. I mean, if you think about it, like, you got to make sure if one goes down, the other one's still there. And if it's like on the same server in the same room, can't be sure about that.
Yeah, I mean, and even I used to have like code access to my server room because we took credit card transactions, and so Visa required that. There were some interesting rules around all of that seem to be similar, but maybe even more strict these days. So like if a company came to you and they wanted to engage, what's a typical engagement look like?
So we work with companies that want to improve their overall cybersecurity, both to reduce the risk and very often for compliance purposes, whether it's that if it's a government regulation, an industry regulation, like the payment card sector, because that payment card sector is actually overseen by the credit card companies, not the government.
Right.
Or sometimes it's a business partner or maybe a customer, right? Like say a startup wants to sell SaaS product to big banks. Those big banks are going to want to make sure they're doing cybersecurity. So those are the type of companies we work with, and so the companies we work with, they have to do it. A lot of times they don't just feel like doing it. They have to do it. So when they reach out to us, we try to do a thorough scoping to get an idea of what they want done. Because when you're having a conversation about cybersecurity, it's easy to get confused. Like the customer might think they're talking of, they want to talk about one app. And someone like me, for example, might think they're talking about everything within their company, and they're not. So you want to really figure it all out before you get any deeper into it. And then we work with some companies on an ongoing basis, like with a subscription model, or sometimes it's just a one-time project that could last a week. Or
Do you help them ensure that they're meeting like regulatory compliance issues?
yeah, oh yeah, that's definitely a big part of it, and that's where we think we're uniquely well, not one of a kind, but more rare than not, because a lot of companies will help you lower your cyber risk, and they either don't know or don't care about the compliance because they get enough business. And then you have the compliance people, which know how to go through a checklist and ask questions, but they can't really think about the day-to-day operational nature of running the business and looking at the risks and dealing with it. So my company brings both together for the benefit of our clients.
I can remember doing some contract work for mortgage companies, and it didn't surprise me at all, obviously having come from a tech leadership background, but a lot of the team was surprised because the first time working at a financial institution, and they went and maybe they misspelled the word and, maybe they just put AD, and they had to go back to the web page and put an N.
Yeah.
It required a complete QA of the website. And they were like, how come? Why? Well, the answer was that they were trying to like basically go above and beyond to make sure that they were exceeding the expectations of the regulatory people. And it used to drive some of the developers crazy. But once you get used to that, it's just a part of the rollout process. I made a change. Here's the documentation of what I did. Now please go check and make sure I didn't, open a back door for somebody by accident. And that's one of the things that kept, like when I'd lead my team, I'd say to them, the reason they want this is because, what if one of you decided you were going to quit and you're going to be malicious and create a back door? Well, QA needs to check this out and make sure they don't find stuff like that. And they would literally, at that place, one of the few places they ever saw QA do a code review too afterward, just to make sure that none of that was existent. So what is like when you step into an engagement, what's one of the most common mistakes you see?
Most common mistakes. It could be a wide range of things, but I look at it from a life cycle process. So on the first minute, I see a mistake very, very often, especially working with the smaller companies, in the fact that they're telling me or someone like me the inner workings of their company without asking for a non-disclosure agreement. Is background checks and non-disclosure agreement pure cybersecurity? No, it's kind of like a HR personnel function. But if you think about it, who you're letting on your system is a big part of protecting the system. Because if you don't even know who these people are, you can't be sure of their intent. Are they a criminal? Do they have a history of doing bad things to the companies that they worked for previously? You don't know. So that's one right off the bat that we see. And then often see not much of a training program, and then the two-factor authentication or lack thereof. So after doing it for as long as I have and going to a lot of events, within like literally a minute or two, I can get a pretty good idea of how the inner workings of a company's cybersecurity are going to look just by some simple questions. Like if you, for example, say you're a business owner, and I say to you, what's your cybersecurity approach? And they give you a look like you just asked them, something that's real, rocket science. That's a 10-second risk assessment right there. Things might not be what they should be.
Yeah, it's funny when my wife and I started our businesses, we'd look at different software and I'd tell her, the software is great, but I don't want to, we're not using it. She'd say, why? Say, well, look at the security levels. There's user and admin. And you'd talk to their support and you'd say, look, I have this person. They work with me. I don't want them to be an admin, but they need to be more than a user. We don't have that. Well, why not? Well, because they can do that with admin. Well, yeah, but they can also get to my payment information. They can make purchases. They can do all this other stuff. Why can't I limit that? And so I'd tell her, you know what? I don't even want to deal with that. And she'd say to me like, well, but we can put processes in place to make sure that they're not doing what they're not supposed to do. I'm like, yeah, you could, but who needs that? And then that just adds one more human element to the process that eventually you're not going to do. And I think that's something that human beings over time, it's very rare to find a person who does the things they're supposed to do every single solitary time. I'm of the belief that it's the time that you don't, that's when something bad's going to happen. And so why leave it to chance? If you don't have the authentication levels I need, I can't use your software. And unfortunately, it's even resulted in situations where the type of software we were looking for, I just ditched the whole idea because it just didn't make sense from a security standpoint. And we don't even have the kind of issue that, most people have. I mean, we have a web server that we have to keep secure, and that's pretty much it. But of course, if they got in there, it opens the keys to the kingdom. So it's firewalls. Let's talk about firewalls. So how important, most to least is having a firewall, relying upon a firewall is a better way to put it.
Oh, definitely. Like if you have a cloud presence, it's definitely important to have a firewall, but with a lot more businesses being on the cloud, somehow there's other things that can also act as a firewall, right? Like a firewall is generally an intrusion detection system, which looks to see if anyone's, trying to get in. And then it's also, some of them are an intrusion, protection system, which can stop it from happening. Kind of different. But then you also have like security groups, which are kind of not as big of a footprint, but you can limit it much like a firewall would. It controls the people and the applications that you're letting interact with a given part of your system. When doing these assessments, and it even says so on like the AWS website, you want to make sure that you have an adequate solution. Does it have to be titled firewall? No. They could have the firewall not doing much, but then their security group configuration or their access control list, which is another thing, kind of like a firewall's on. So generally, you want to have enough in place and have only the accesses granted as what you need. You don't want to have something open just for the sake of it being open, like a firewall port, like just in case we need it. Well, if you need it down the road, and then just open it down the road.
Okay. Yeah. Access control lists, it sounds like not a whole lot's changed because like when I worked with a restaurant delivery service, I was their CTO for 10 years. And
Oh, wow.
I used the firewall more to control what content they could access that was dangerous to the internal part of the network. But then I used access control lists to determine who could go where and what they could gain access to, which if you think about it, it's safer because you can try to block at the firewall, but then you get a little like lax because you think, the firewall's got me covered. But if they get through that somehow because you left a port open that maybe you were testing something and you opened a port and now they get through. If you have access control lists, well, depending on who they got through they're only going to be able to get to so many resources. That's actually a really good tip.
And related to that, you have inbound and outbound rules. So a lot of times we'll see just because something had to happen inbound or outbound, for example, that its counterpart setting was open when it didn't need to be. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a really common. I mean, even on your home machine, in Windows, it'll be like, do you want to open this port? And I'm like, no, actually, I don't want to open the whole port. I just want to provide myself access out. I don't want access back in. That's kind of a no-brainer, but people miss it. And I think one of the things I'm trying to dispel with this episode, the myth I'm trying to dispel with this episode is that, cybersecurity can just be a second thought. And I actually think, because in my opinion, it like at your home, look at the proliferation of Ring doorbell and things like that, and security cameras everywhere. People understand that they need to secure their home, but they don't seem to understand that they also need to secure the electronic aspects of their home as well. And that's one of the things I want people to understand is if you're spending money on a Ring doorbell and it's a subscription to go with it, then why aren't you protecting your business assets with the same kind of level of vehemence? They're just not, they just don't care. I see it. I mean, even at like small coffee shops, you see them and they're like, "Oh, well, the password for that isn't," like, why are you giving the password? Stop.
Oh yeah.
I get it all the time. Like we work with a lot of clients who have WordPress websites, and
Oh yeah. Yep.
I actually use a plugin that called main WP, and it basically has a little tool that sits as a client on the site you want to manage, and it goes to a central place, and it uses like a security key that has to be authenticated every so often. But the point is, it keeps these sites up to date. When a plugin gets a security patch, I know it needs it, I
Yeah.
install it. But also, the other thing about WordPress is like you'll maybe have a problem with a plugin, and support will say, "Hey, I need an admin login to get in." I'm not giving them the admin login. I'll make their own, and then
Yeah.
I'll expire the password, so that and I'll tell them it's good for 2 days. Get in there in the next 48 hours because you're not going to be able to get in if you don't. I've always felt that security of my data is important. But at the same time, then you got people, putting crazy stuff out on social media and expecting that it's not going to get picked up by someone. Like you said, like the MGM thing,
Yeah.
people put a lot of information on LinkedIn that maybe shouldn't be there. And then they use that information like, "Oh, I went to high school at blah, blah, blah place." Well,
Yeah.
what the security question is, what's the name of the mascot at your high school? Well, that's a stupid question to use because you publicized what your high school was.
Absolutely. You said so many good things there. Like going back to the fact that people do realize to a higher degree that they need to protect their home, especially if they've had something happen. But that same thought process should extend to the business because it's all your life. Like if you have a data breach at the office and your company might go bankrupt because of it. Because if the average breach costs $140 per record, so even a breach of just 1,000 user records, that's $140,000 right there. A lot of businesses can't handle that, then that's going to spill over quickly to your home life. When you're trying to have dinner with your family and you can't think straight because you don't know how your business is going to be doing in the next year. But also those features you mentioned, having more than just admin and user. I think a lot of companies are realizing it needs to be more granular than that, and so I think that's getting better. So you can customize, give out what's needed. With small companies, even having access to tools like MS365, they're afforded the enterprise level security features on a small budget, like the feature you said about giving access for limited time. That's fair. That's a great feature. So a small company can do cybersecurity without a big budget. To say it's not being done because of budget, it's just not realistic. It can be done.
Yeah, it makes sense because this is the first house I've lived in where we've got a quote smart home. And honestly, I didn't love the idea of having like a coded lock for my front door. But the more that I've utilized it, I found a lot of benefits to it. Like we can have when we need someone to come in, and if we're going to be gone for them most of the day, and we need someone to come in and take the dogs out, we can
Oh
give
yeah.
them a code, and it's only good for the time frame they say they're coming. If they say I'm going to be there like 5 o'clock, well, we make it good from like 4 to 6, and then that way, if they're a little early, they'll get in. If they're and if they stay a little later,
Yeah.
they can get in, or come a little later, they can get in. But
Smart.
it's a
Yeah.
game changer because being able to put a code in that then goes away when you tell it to go away, it's so much. Someone takes a key for your lock, they could go copy that key as many times as they want and pass it out to as many people as they want. I know I'm reaching here, but they can really breach your
Yeah.
security. But with a code, go ahead and give the code out. It's not going to work the next time you come. So, go for it. So as a tech person, do you still have to do the typical, late nights, working overnight to implement certain things?
Oh yeah, yeah, very often. Like just last night, going into this morning, I was up till about 3:45 a.m. Just me looking at my three monitors in a customer's Microsoft instance, going through the Center for Internet Security benchmark on it, which is a 396-page document saying how it needs to be configured. So my approach on that is to do meetings and events during the day, and then for all the work, the things where I can sit alone and just lock in, I do it at night.
Yeah, me too. I do that with my NetSuite work. One of the issues that, like, I also do business coaching with tech executives, and one of the issues that they have is focus.
Oh
So,
yeah.
some of them deal with it through coffee, some of them deal with it through energy drinks. But I discovered this thing is called Magic Mind. It's just a little shot that you drink in the morning, and it's got these nootropics, matcha, some adaptogens, and it really, I was surprised after a couple of days. My focus was crazy good. I would
Oh.
I would always be super tired by like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon because I was up late. And so like Magic Mind like kind of fixed that. And so now my mornings, my afternoons, and my evenings are equally focused. So like if that's a problem that anybody has out there, just give Magic Mind a shot. You can pick it up at magicmind.com/gaining technology and join their community. They've got a lot of people in there who tell you things about tricks for staying focused. But for listeners of the show, they're giving a 50% off the subscription. So within the next 10 days after this show airs, if you use the code Tech Leadership, you'll get 50% off. And after 10 days, you'll get 20% off a single purchase. So head over there to magicmind.com, gaining technology, and use the code Tech Leadership. And if you want to just try it, you can go to Sprouts Farmers Markets and grab a few bottles. So it's a product I found and actually works. I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised that it works. But it's interesting because as tech people, I love how you said you plan events and meetings during the day, because that's exactly what I do. Like I do consulting for NetSuite, and I have meetings with clients, status updates. I go to industry events, meetups, and whatnot during the day hours. And then, I plan the early part of the evening for family time. And then later on, I sit down in front of the computer and I
Yeah.
pump out the work. And it's unfortunately, it also messes with my sleep schedule so badly that, I mean, if I get 5 hours sleep in a night, I'm lucky. But you kind of get used to it after a while. So tell me something,
Absolutely.
as someone who came from the government, you mentioned that in a sense you said it's a great training ground because they're so such sticklers about that. Compare the government, say one of your more secure clients before you came. How does it compare? Like, what are the differences?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The government, they generally use best practices, as they say. They have different parties looking into what's going on and giving their feedback, and they're good about watching the perimeter to make sure things are being watched. I mean, it's pretty straightforward approach as long as it's done. Banks do that as well with their security operations center, but by having someone actively monitoring it instead of just going to the logs a week or two after something happened, that's an advantage right there. Some of my clients, I've seen them have third parties that do that, like a cybersecurity service provider. You can have, it doesn't have to be your company doing it. There are service providers that can do that for a monthly fee or a hourly fee or whatever you want to say. I would say non-government is less formal on the compliance aspect, and it might seem like a small thing, right? But it is cybersecurity from the risk perspective and the compliance perspective. I personally view them as being extremely correlated, probably more so than a lot of people in our industry.
That's interesting. I would have thought that had been the answer too, because like if you look at like, as far as governmental agencies go, look at the police. They see everything. I mean, I remember going once on a ride along with a police officer, and we pulled out of the police station, and right away he said, "Oh, we're going to pull that guy over." And I said, "Why?" He said, "He's on his phone." And I'm looking and I don't see him on his phone. It was on his knee. Police officer saw it. And I think that's the thing, having a trained person observing what's going on with the perimeter of your network is really important, because you're right. Going through the log and coming back and going, "Hey boss, somebody's been in our network." It's a little too late. That's like saying I left the front door open and I just leave it open all the time, and hey, someone was in my house, and you find out a week later. It's not good. So that's actually a great point. And I would imagine from the government's perspective, they spend the money to keep it secure because of the things that the overarching things that a breach could cause. I mean, some pretty severe consequences of doing that. Well, this has been an interesting conversation. why don't you let our
Definitely.
people know where they could find you if they want to reach out and maybe engage with your company?
Agree, Mike. It's been great talking to you. Our company Yastis can be found at yastis.com. That's YASTIS. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And me personally, I spend most of my time on LinkedIn, where you can find me by searching for Michael Andrews. That's ANDREWES.
Awesome. I'll make sure all of that gets into the notes so people don't have to quickly jot it all down. But thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You're a very knowledgeable person. I really appreciate the input.
Absolutely, Mike. It's been a pleasure. And if I could ever help with anything in the future, feel free to reach out anytime.
Will do. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in for another episode of Gaining the Technology Leadership Edge. We'll be back next week, every Wednesday, 8 a.m. Pacific time.